I've been practicing as an architect for over 15 years, and I've just completed my term as the 70th National President of the Australian Institute of Architects, where I focused on sustainable cities and architecture. And my aim, not surprisingly, was to raise awareness about cities and greenhouse gas emissions, and to profile the value of smaller houses close to amenities. So I really do have that in common with our keynote speaker, David. And David, I'd like to congratulate you both on your writings and on your keynote address today. But I'd like to respond somewhat obliquely, and I'll respond with a letter written in 2050. In that letter, I'll touch briefly on Canberra, starting with the recent past, and then projecting forward to 2050, where I'll be 80 years old, and I write this letter. So imagine, ladies and gentlemen, if you will, a letter to the 110th National President of the Australian Institute of Architects in 2050. Firstly, let me congratulate you on becoming the 110th National President, and exactly 40 years earlier, I had completed my own term, and what a year it had been. 2050 is indeed a milestone, and we've achieved a lot in our cities, but it wasn't easy, and this letter describes the immense challenge we faced. When I was born, Australian houses were around 120 square metres, with just under 4 occupants on average. By 2010, I was 40, and my hometown of Canberra had the largest houses in the country, with Australia, as David mentioned, the largest on average in the world. Around 250 square metres, with 2 bathrooms, 2 living spaces, a 2-car garage, and just over 2 household occupants, they had become oversized and under-occupied. Of course, Burley Griffin originally had much higher densities in mind for Canberra. 3- and 4-storey walk-ups, attached and semi-detached terrace-style houses with shared gardens were envisaged close to amenities and along major boulevards. It was to be a small city, but by the time I was born, the Y-Plan framed expansion of Canberra, a series of linked town centres made possible by the car. I finished as National President around the eve of World Environment Day 2010. Reflecting on that day, what was Canberra's report card? It was true Canberra offered a high quality of life, but its environmental footprint per capita was approaching 4 times sustainable levels. Household energy consumption had grown, and as we spread further, Canberra's average density had actually dropped over 40 years. We were struggling to retain the population densities necessary for schools, shops, public transport, and emergency services to function effectively. And we were burdened financially by the replication of infrastructure and amenities in each new suburb. And as house construction in outer Canberra continued to outstrip housing more centrally, annually we travelled 35 million bus kilometres compared with 3,000 million car kilometres. Would we ever live smaller, closer, and drive less? Meanwhile, the Institute of Architects was collaborating on sustainable cities through the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, or ASBEC. Through ASBEC, we focused on buildings and the substantial energy and emission reductions to be made. We focused on precincts, with distributed energy at a precinct scale being evaluated for its benefits. And we focused on cities, proposing a framework to evaluate the sustainable economic and livability performance of our cities. But our ASBEC research was also telling us that more Australians were driving and more often. And even with compact city strategies, by 2050, emissions would be up 45% on 2010 levels. Clearly, city design strategies were not enough, and policy incentives were needed to urgently get Australians out of their cars. So what of government? Late 2009, Minister Albanese said the Commonwealth's recent exile from urban policy had ended, and by March 2010, we had the State of Australian Cities report. Then at the Built Environment Meets Parliament Summit, our city metro strategies were assessed, and they were assessed against the COAG Planning Task Force criteria for cities, and effectively kick-started by industry. The first reports were released June 16, 2010. So it's 2050 and I'm still here, and it's warmer, oil is scarce and our rainfall is erratic. We've had our first water war. Australia is at 35 million and Canberra's population has grown by 50%. Back in 2013, to mark Canberra's centenary, a referendum saw its growth boundaries secured, and by 2050, Canberra had grown within its boundaries by retrofitting existing suburbs and inner urban areas. This took the form of medium-density terrace houses, which appeared around town centres and along major boulevards, peppered by some high-rise. A much-loved garden city, densities rose once more from 450 people to 650 people per square kilometre. And I'll just mention that New York's more like 10,000 people per square kilometre. To the surprise of Canberrans, the garden city character remained and was revitalised. And as populations increased around town centres, we linked them with light rail in 2030, while parking costs were increased and a levy imposed on cars journeying to the city centre. By 2040, net increases of private car mileage were no longer permissible for new developments, and offset contributions to other transport networks resulted. And with private car usage down 70%, vast tracts of bitumen was reclaimed for urban food production and claimed by pedestrians and cyclists. By 2050, our average house size had halved. Autonomous precinct-based water and energy infrastructure was retrofitted throughout the city. And technologies enabled more flexible, multi-purpose buildings and work practices as the boundaries between home, work and the public realm blurred. So here we are in 2050. Canberra's environmental footprint per capita has dropped 60%. And as our report card continues to improve, I wish you well in your role as the 110th President of the Institute of Architects. And finally, I'll close by saying that these projects are all projects that exist now, and these success stories are available to us. There are examples in Australia and around the world. Our challenge is to make them mainstream and to act. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to this fantastic series of lectures. David, you won't have any argument with me about the importance of making our cities more compact. Indeed, in Sydney, some of our most expensive and desirable suburbs are in fact the most dense. However, I've spent 35 years trying to convince the community, ministers, premiers, prime ministers, that in fact compact cities integrated with infrastructure implementation is the way to go. And I have to say that while they support it in principle, there's not a lot of support in practice, and I think we see our cities today as the results of that lack of action. Yes, Gen Y know very well about the desirability of living in inner city. They like being close to their work, close to their friends, close to their cafes, close to their gyms. That's the kind of life that they know is a really good life, even if they may not know that by doing so they are improving their climate footprint. Baby boomers, some baby boomers like myself, moved back into apartments despite the cost of actually picking up and moving. Most people I talk to agree that sprawl is bad, congestion is worse, and most people agree that better public transport is needed. But not if our house prices go up because we're not releasing enough land on the fringe. Not if that means high-rise in my neighbourhood. Not, excuse me, David, definitely not if it looks like New York City. Not if I have no choice. Not in my neighbourhood, and definitely not if I've got kids. So the Aussie perceived character of the burbs is really alive and well, and those of us who want to change that do so at our peril, as I've discovered in many community meetings. The community really hates change, and that's understandable, but change we have to, because if we are going to tackle the issue of climate change, our cities have to look different in the future. And in my experience, as close as I might have come to the power of pollies, pollies are not going to lead us there if we don't give them permission to do so and tell them that that's the direction we want to go in. New York City grew up dense. Our challenge here in Australia is actually to retrofit our cities and parts of our cities to become more dense if we're going to achieve the sort of outcome that David posited today. We have to focus on density where density can realistically be achieved, and that's around the CBD, and I'm sure Rob is going to talk about what was achieved here in Melbourne. Same thing happened in Sydney. Around the regional centres, where we can actually get really close living and working, we need to ask our governments to be strong in supporting major redevelopments, because those are opportunities to try to achieve that better density without ruining the suburbs. And we definitely need to ask all our governments to improve our public transport, to support the density that we will be looking to. And I can give you an example. I was involved in planning Ultimo Pyrmont, which is a suburb just behind Darling Harbour, if any of you know Sydney. The population in Ultimo Pyrmont went from 2,000 to 20,000 in 15 years. It has the lowest car ownership of any suburb in Sydney. It has a school which the education department wanted to close because families are not going to live in apartments. It is now one of the largest primary schools, and they've had to add in more demountables in order to cope with the overflow. Most people walk to work. There's open space, a light rail, affordable housing program, and in post-occupancy surveys, people really love living there. Now, being close to the influence, I was talking one day to a former Premier, and I think Nick might have been in the room, and I was making the case for a new integrated metropolitan plan with infrastructure and public transport. And that Premier walked me to the window of his office and pointed down into Macquarie Street, and he said, "See that?" He said, do I see people marching for a new city plan with public transport attached? And of course you look down into Macquarie Street and there's no one there. And you go, well, no, but we all know it's the right thing to do. And yesterday evening's discussion about climate change and the ethics of climate change, we talked about, for those of you who might not have been there, we talked about, we know that we have to do something about climate change. How do we mobilize the community to actually say that that has to happen? After that meeting, I decided that, in fact, we as a community do have to want climate change and want changes in our cities, and we have to tell our politicians that. We have to give them permission to lead us in a new direction. And one of the things I do at the moment is I chair a Built Environment Industry Innovation Council, and we've been looking at how do we get people to want to live differently than they have done in the past. What is it? Certainly traditional communication methods is not the way to go. Advertising about how wonderful it is to put in new light bulbs and to buy different kinds of fridges is not the way to go. So we've been looking at different ways to engage the community, to actually get them themselves looking at different ways of living. And we need to really build on the Aussie spirit of sport and competition. Do you know which business has grown 800% in the last few years? Dance classes. And which is the second? Cooking classes. And why? Because many of you have been watching those shows on television, and you've decided that you could dance with the stars and do things differently. So apparently you're all out there in huge numbers dancing and cooking. So we think that we need to throw out the carbon cops, because they just make you feel guilty, and we need to bring in a new kind of involving people thinking about how can my neighbourhood beat that neighbourhood, which will beat that neighbourhood. So watch this space, move over our restaurant rules, and bring in my neighbourhood rules. So the solution is, let's engage the community in the positives. Let's get dense around our regional centres. That's our only hope. And let's get cities built, linked with public transport, and let's support our politicians to lead us in that new direction. Thank you.
I came to this city in 1983 as one of 5 consultants asked to write a strategy for the future. The brief was that they wanted a 24-hour city, but they wanted it to feel like Melbourne, and that was the councillors of the day. We wrote a strategy that was based on increasing the mixed use in the city, increasing the density, building it with the local character, making it feel like Melbourne, developing a high-quality public realm that people could walk in and use and feel comfortable in, and reconnecting it with things like the river. 25 years later, and I'll leave you to judge the success of it, socially, it's more diverse. Environmentally, we are reducing our greenhouse gases in the city, and although not fast enough, we are heading in the right direction. And economically, the rate in a dollar in the city has dropped over the last 10 years from 13 cents to 6. So you could argue on the criteria of social, environmental, and economic, those strategies have worked over the last 20, 25 years. And the city has been voted one of the most livable cities on a number of occasions. We now sit at a period where urban populations are going to double over the next 50 years, not in Australia only, but worldwide. We're going to have to double the amount of urbanism that we've built since the start of civilization in 50 years. And we're going to have to do it while cities are chugging out 75 to 80% of the greenhouse gases. So how do we do that? And I'm an optimist. I think we can do it. And my optimism comes from when I was at university. And I was a baby boomer. I arrived at university in the mid-60s, and we all seemed to arrive at once, and nobody quite knew what to do with us. There were too many of us, and the universities weren't big enough. Many universities expanded, and we had new universities built in the UK, Germany, and all over the world. But the campus I went to had nowhere to expand. It was surrounded by National Park, and it had a village to the south. What they did is they analysed the resources they already had. And what they worked out is things like lecture theatres, rooms like this, were being used for about 17% of the time. So what they did is they reprogrammed. They looked at what resources they had, and they just reprogrammed their campus. I was invited back to that campus 30 years later to give a lecture, and I looked at the population, student population, and it quadrupled. My fear was that I was going to arrive at this fantastic campus and it was not going to feel familiar. It would have been destroyed by the development that would have taken place. To my pleasant surprise, when I arrived there, I find not that it had been overbuilt. They had built on the car parks that used to exist at the entrances to the campus. The campus was thriving from 8 in the morning to 12 at night. It felt vibrant, and it felt very familiar. And I asked myself, if they can do that on a campus, can we do that on a city? In the last 18 months, we've looked at Melbourne, and we've just done that exercise. We can double the population of Melbourne without subdividing another hectare of land. We have enough. We don't need more. If we put people around the stations we've got, which is part of the state government strategy, we know we can house up to 900,000 people without building above 7 or 8 stories. If we actually take all those properties that are facing onto tram and bus routes that existing tram and bus routes, and we take out heritage, and we take out the small blocks, and we take out public use and industrial blocks less than 6 meters, we can actually house 2.4 million people along those routes without building over 5 or 6 stories. And if you take the known redevelopment sites that actually have planning applications in the system, we get another 500,000 people. What we would be doing is we'd be building around that infrastructure we've already got. We know the way we're building our cities is not working. You just have to go to Griffith University vampire study and look at all our capital cities, and you'll see the poverty we're building in on the fringe of our cities. And we've heard about why that is today from David. I think the future, if we can take the fear out of it, and if we can have the dialogue that we need to have between the community and the politicians, is actually a fantastic future. The cities will feel familiar. We'll have greater density and we'll have greater mixed use. We'll be able to walk out of the suburbs that don't have to be touched, because remember, 90% or 92.5% of the city we're not touching. So the suburbs can become green, they can collect their energy, they can actually sequester some of the carbon, and they can collect the water. We have enough infrastructure. Unfortunately, in Australia, when we think of infrastructure, we think of things that have to be photographed from 4 kilometres and cost $1 billion. We have to get out of that mindset and back into the mindset of enough, not more. Thank you.
Well, I've never been a former past president, and I'm unlikely to be a future president of anything. I think in primary school I was sacked for being class captain by eating another kid's play lunch. But Sue's given me the idea to write a pilot for a combined dancing and cooking show, so I'm off. So how I'll respond to the task that Tim set out for us is that there's a lot of hype on the role cities can play in tackling climate change. There's big numbers. You've heard some of them today. 50% of the world's population live in cities. In Australia, it's probably 75, 80%. Cities are responsible for 70% of emissions. Buildings are responsible for 40% of emissions. They're all interesting numbers, but they're largely useless for urban managers at the local level, because we don't have those levers at our hands to pull. And I think you can see this in how the politics of climate and city policy is played out across the country. Every local government pretty much in Australia has set huge aspirational targets for emission reductions. If you actually trawl through their websites now, almost without exception, they're either changing the target or changing that date the target was meant to come, or both, because they haven't met them. They've got nowhere near them. In fact, emissions have gone up. And they've gone up because I don't think there's been a mechanism for change. And I know people might hate change, but change is constant, and it's what we expect, and I think we're cultured to accept it, and I think there's hope. And when you think about those targets that have been set, if those statements have been made by the private sector, the ACCC has powers to prosecute against false or misleading carbon claims. There would almost not be a sector of government where federal, state and local government politicians and public servants could not be prosecuted if the rules were the same. It is that strong. As far as metropolitan strategies, well, Sue, you did get your wish. Pretty much every city has raced to develop metropolitan strategies as soon as you walked out of the door. Maybe you were marching in the streets. But it's a question for our curator here that surely in terms of greenhouse, and given the gravity and urgency of the situation, the basic key performance indicator of those strategies would have to be a reduction in per capita and absolute emissions, regardless of growth. True? Mr. Curator said yes. Okay, well, I can tell him without exception, not one metropolitan strategy does that, not one. And when you think about even the latest one, so, you know, Melbourne did one, Sydney learned off Melbourne, don't know if it was any better, you know, The latest one that's been done is Adelaide, and seeing I'm from Sydney and I'm speaking in Melbourne, I thought I'd kick Adelaide up the pants rather than have a brawl. So in terms of one of their key outcomes for the better greenhouse performance of new buildings was to have a round-table discussion with the Australian Buildings Code Board. If you want to lose 10 years of your life, that's the action that you want to actually set out to do. Now, the Australian Buildings Code Board are the people that brought us the metric of 5-star housing. Okay, you have that, we all have that across the country. Have you ever noticed how those 5-star houses, they get bigger every year? David alluded to that. Their roofs get blacker and they consume more energy than ever. That is the metric that governments have said governs new construction. And I think, as a planning profession, we've been negligent in accepting such loose and sloppy metrics. So the next time Tim's talking to the head of the IPCC, I don't see him discussing stars. We need a reduction or an increase in stars. He's talking tons of CO2. And you know what? It's not too hard. We can actually rate the performance of new and existing buildings on carbon dioxide. We can do it on neighbourhoods and precincts. And we can do it on cities. I know this because we have done it. So Nick and I, we've built a tool that can do this. We're launching it with 3 local governments next month. It can be done. It's weird to us as ex-public servants that government hasn't done it. A small suburban consultancy. It's not Nick and I. We're not the smart ones. We've got 12 smart people doing it. But I mean, it can be done. And what I think about the profession being negligent, and I'm serious, I don't think it's just been sloppy, I think it's been negligent, is that 9 years ago, I organised a conference for Sue on Sustainable Sydney. We had a closing speaker of Paul Keating. Not many people liked the speech. I thought it was a cracking speech. Yes, it was full of ego and ambition. But what I got out of it was he talked about when he floated the dollar and when he deregulated the bank, he created billions of dollars worth of capital floating around in our superannuation accounts looking for a place to invest. And it wanted to invest in property and it wanted to invest in cities. And the key point he made was the planning system had remained the same. While the development industry just got turbocharged with cash, we were still colouring in maps with red and green pencils. The world has moved on, the profession can do better. I want to give you a case study because I want to put some hope into this, that we have done the numbers, we have done the modelling, and it doesn't have to be, I think, like David said, that we're going to spend the rest of our 60 parts per million budget on building wind turbines and solar farms, because I think what Rob alluded to, you can redefine the problem. You don't have to build into your model continuous growth, continuous consumption at the scale that we've experienced over the last 200 years. So we were lucky enough to be part of a consortium that did the modelling for the City of Sydney, so the LGA, the CBD of Sydney. We did everything, fuel switching, tri-generation efficiencies, more walking, more cycling. We got a 60% reduction against BAU, regardless of the growth. The Lord Mayor then asked us to do it for every Australian capital city as part of an exercise that she wanted to take to Copenhagen. Because the CBDs of Sydney and Melbourne got advantages over the other capital cities, we only got a 40% on average on land use and transport activities in every capital city. The real premise of the brief from the Lord Mayor of Sydney and the other capital city Lord Mayors, we want to actually get a document that can show the Prime Minister that the 5% reduction target's not big enough. We want to show how great cities can be. So when you take that 40% land use and transport reduction, it only equals about 40% of the 5% target. The Lord Mayor's advisors were shocked, they were horrified, they didn't know what to do with the study. But my view is, we didn't do industry, we didn't do agriculture, we didn't do a whole bunch of freight, we didn't do a whole bunch of other things. But cities can achieve a 40 to 60% reduction. And I think what's been holding us back in doing the simple things aggressively, and you have to be aggressive, is that we've got all these aspirational things of climate positive, carbon neutral, targets that can't be met. Not right now, they will be in the future, and I think we've got to take the transition. I think if you were offered a 50% reduction from a city in 2 decades or less, you'd take it right now. Thank you.
And the first question is, I think, directly to Rob, and it's from John Bergin. And John says, is it fair to say that our current Melbourne 2030 development approach is currently demonstrating how dysfunctional the relationships are between designers, engineers, planners, politicians and the community? And how do you see this changing?
I'm not sure where the 2030, which is the state government strategy, which basically said they would actually build on the activity centres, i.e. where the railway stations are, and put their density there. And the fact that it isn't working is symptomatic of a lack of coordination between the different professions. I think it is symptomatic of a problem I think we have in government. I think what we've seen in government since the 1980s is the difficulty of going from a good policy to implementation. And I think what a lot of governments haven't realised is they actually contracted out most of the intellect in government that enabled them to actually take a good policy document and work out how to implement it. The policy they've got, 2030, is very good, and you can apply overlays to that to make it even better. And we could apply a planning scheme to it that could actually be very slim, that would actually make it work. But we have worldwide a lack of intellect to make what I call the intelligent client within government. We have risk managers, we have project managers, we have people who manage everything except getting the stuff on the ground.
Thanks, Rob. That's a really insightful point. I suppose one of the things that I've felt also is that, you meet all these three-brained consultants who come through the door when you're in government and you say, gee, I wish some of those young people who'd decided to go and work with some of those consultancies were actually working in government.
Absolutely. When we get the young people coming back to work in government, it'll be a sign that it's back to the place it used to be, a respected place to work.
Thanks. I've got a question here from Tony Thwaites, and I think it's probably best directed at Sue. Sue, to what extent is urban sprawl which blights our cities the result of market failure or regulatory failure? If it's market-driven failure, how can consumer demands be altered? I suppose picking up on some of the points you were making about we actually have to want this, how?
That's a really good question. The market is a very conservative one. Particularly in the home building sector, what was successful when I sold it last week will probably be what I'll build next week. There's a very strong sense that house prices are going up because there's not enough land released, and land is deemed to be land on the fringe. So there's a very strong lobby that, to governments that they have to keep releasing more land on the fringe. Now, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that you do need to do both. But both Melbourne 2030 and the Sydney Metropolitan Strategy looks to the future of our cities in terms of all new stock being around about between 60 and 70% attached dwellings as opposed to detached dwellings on the fringe, if we're going to meet the targets to accommodate the population growth that's projected. You can rest assured that even if that happened in 20 years, you'd still have 65% of all the housing stock in both those cities as detached houses, because we've got such a misbalance at the moment between the kind of space that people are occupied. So in answer to the question, I think it is both a regulatory failure and a market failure. I think it goes back to the point that Rob was talking about, which is how do you actually make the best use of the resources that we have, and how do you retrofit our cities without having to just release endlessly land on the fringe.
Could I just add something small to that? I think there are two things that are not being recognised. The market is shifting. In 62 local areas in Melbourne, you're selling more apartments than you're selling detached. The other thing that I think people have missed is the only sector of our population that is declining is the nuclear family, mother and two kids, mother, dad and two kids. That's actually going down. We've got increases of two-people families, a lot of them baby boomers, and a rapid increase in single-people families. So we're actually building the wrong product.
I'm not referring back to a question because I'm going to have to shuffle, but I'm going to throw a question back to you therefore, Rob, is what success have you had in actually getting younger families to not move out into the burbs but stay closer to an urban centre?
Well, I think that will only start to happen once the opportunities are offered. I mean, when in 1992 we started to offer accommodation in the central city, and we were told Australians didn't live in the central city. But once we started to offer it in a very simple form, in many cases just a shell that people could move into, a lot of the younger people came back in. And you had, I think we've got 5,000 students today who actually live in the centre of Melbourne. So I think they will come back, but we're going to have to make it affordable as well. And one of the biggest problems we've got in Australia at the moment is to capture the uplift in property when we increase its value. So under the planning scheme, if we increase its value by changing the use, we don't capture that value back and put it back into affordable housing or public open space or one of those things.
Public transport.
And I think one of the strategies you could do along the transport corridors is if you're going to increase the built value of that house from a single story to, say, a 5 or 6 story, is capture 25 to 30% of that and put it back into affordable housing. And if you do it at that stage, it becomes quite easy.
Okay, I'm just going to take a couple of questions from the floor, and then I'll go back to the questions that have come from the break. Gentleman down here in the yellow.
My name is Leon. Hello, everybody. I wish everybody healthy and happy. My area, philosopher, ethic, and metaphysics, and history, and political, and environment. I'm so happy I am here. When we study quantum physics, we are create atmosphere. We are create reality. I want to explain for you 5,000 years in the past.
Now, Leon, I don't want you to. What I want from you is a question.
Yeah, I question, please. I give you example, 5,000 years, people like Assyrian, like Babylon, like Osman Empire, like Roman Empire, Persian Empire, create great building. But 21st century, we live in the Melbourne, we go to Melbourne Center, we see big building, beautiful building, look good, but leaking. What is it? My question like that, people in the past, more concerned about environment than modern civilization. They create building still lasting after 5,000 years. But what happened in the Melbourne Center, building, water leaking, and certain cross station, roof damage in the heavy rain these years. Why we lose money, why we lose energy, and we see this situation. How can we fix this problem? In the philosopher, we need find problem. When we find problem, discover problem, we need face problem. How can we fix this problem? Thank you.
Leon, I've got it. Thank you. Clear. It reminded me of something that Bob Carr, possibly in that rather nice office that Sue mentioned, used to say when he was concerned about the quality of residential flat building in Sydney. And what he used to say was, how was it when we had an economy as we did 100 years ago, and look at the beautiful quality of residential flat buildings we built then compared to the awful profit boxes, which is his term, copyright Bob Carr, 2001, profit boxes, that we build in Sydney now. And yet we're so much richer as a community. I think that's a question to Rob, given it was Melbourne specific. It's about the quality of the built form in this city and how we can ensure high quality.
Look, I think that's really hard because I think the market mechanisms that actually deliver property have changed. Many of the buildings that were built were actually retained in the ownership of the people who built them. So they built them with the ideology that they might be in it in 100 years' time, and therefore they built it with a certain quality. I mean, we've just built ourselves an office block in Melbourne, and it happens to be one of 2 6-star as-built green office buildings. We built it because we can actually save $2.4 million a year by having fresh air in it and running it in a healthy way. But we own it. And I think what's changed is the ownership. People used to own their buildings and therefore have a pride in them and build them to last. Development now, we buy them, they build them. sell them as fast as they can go, and then go on to the next one. And I think that's a fundamental problem we've got. I don't know how you fix it.
Can I maybe just build on that and ask Sue, I mean, to what extent do you actually think that this is a problem with our political economy? It's actually a root problem within the relationship between our economy and our politics and therefore our policy.
No, I think that, I mean, people say, despite that gentleman's view, that the design of buildings in Melbourne is significantly better than the design of buildings in Sydney. And I do think it is a question of how we value good design. Yes, there's a problem, I agree with Rob, there's a problem with people building speculatively in effect and selling a building on, whether it's a commercial building or not. But I think we as a consumer have been more prepared than we should to take what they give us and to say, well, thanks, you know, that's the best you can do, we'll have it. And I think we've got to become more sophisticated consumers.
Yep. Bruce.
Well, Nick, you'll remember when we regulated basics in New South Wales, it was for residential buildings because the people that built the dwellings didn't live in them. We didn't regulate the commercial sector because we felt like the superannuation funds had an interest in actually purchasing good buildings, and so the regulation didn't need to be as strong. But in the residential sector, we've again just lived for the wrong metric. It was floor space. So all those investors that talked about buying homes just said, buy the biggest home you could. That was the rule of the day. And I think you've got to regulate against that.
Okay, another question down here. Now, I know that you've asked 2 questions in the Deakin Lecture Series previously, and I am really happy for you to ask a third. I have no problem with it at all. But, yeah, are you okay to let a gentleman here who I don't think has yet asked a question to ask a question? The gentleman in the glasses. Thank you very much for your generosity. Your name?
Thanks. Paul Kennedy. So my question is, I can understand how every demographic can have an improvement in lifestyle in a high-density city, except for the 3 to 13-year-olds. How do we do the go outside and play after school? How do we do, what do the children in those high-density cities do on weekends?
Melinda, would you like to comment?
Sure. I might just return briefly to the Canberra example and just touch again on Burley Griffin's original vision, which was to have medium and high density housing, but to have shared gardens and parks in effect. And there's a lot of European examples that achieve that. So I don't think we have to assume that moving from the suburbs into the cities means moving away from areas for kids to play. But I think it's also a decision about how we give our land over. And if we give a high percentage of our land to roads and to having a driveway coming into and I guess coming in and connecting to every front door, then that's land that we can't otherwise use for, say, parks for kids to play. So it's really about not trying to get £20 in a £10 bag.
David, I know that you write quite compellingly about that point in your life when you were making decisions partly based on that criteria. I'd like your response, and then I'd like Bruce's response as well.
Right. I think it's the issue. I think that people who are, for example, college students, live very greenly just by nature. Residential college students, because they're living in small spaces right on top of each other. They walk to all their daily destinations. At the other end of the age spectrum, I play bridge with a group of women in their 80s. Every one of them lives in dread of the day when she can no longer drive, because when that happens where we live, her life is over because she can't go anywhere. I think for those two demographics, density, for my daughter's age, she's 26, she lives in Manhattan in an apartment that's smaller than her childhood bedroom, and she's thrilled. There's no problem there, and the demographic is the one in the middle. It's the families with those kids. I think that for that reason, there are environmental issues in cities that don't seem like environmental issues. There are things like education, recreation, crime, just stuff on the streets. Those are environmental issues in an urban setting, much more than solar panels on roofs, which are essentially irrelevant. And they're not easy to solve. I think we have a better head start at the other ends of the spectrum. But there's also something which is that there's a difference between the lives we really live and the lives we imagine ourselves living, and we see that in suburbs. You can travel in the States, you can travel for hours through suburbs and not seeing a single child playing outside. In fact, if you want to see kids outside, you often go to an urban setting where everyone is outside all the time. So there's also a disconnect between how we imagine we live and how we actually do live. But I think I agree that it's not necessarily true that in the city there's no outdoor life. And it's also not necessarily true that in the suburbs there is this rich, unfolding childhood going on, like the childhood I imagine that I had in the 1950s.
Bruce?
If you get on Google Earth and have a look at the new estates that get built, and you see the large houses from boundary to boundary and the tiny backyard, there's no amenity for kids to play in those backyards. The roads and the infrastructure is significantly not suited for the public. And as a quick case study, Nick, we're involved with SGS and others, good urban planners, proposing the development in the ACT for the ACT government. 4,000 dwellings, 9,000 people. We're proposing small compact mews or row housing that achieves 50% reductions in emissions, land use, transport. It's fantastic. Government gets a better return in land sales. It makes government more money. It actually is cheaper to buy for the purchasers and cheaper to run for the occupants. It's not radical, but it's functional. And the Canberra Times ran a poll on it to say we don't want mews housing, and 65% of people said, of course we don't, we want Canberra to remain the same, people hate change. But 35% of people said they would live in it. And yet we only want 10% of the housing in this 4,000 dwellings to be mews housing. So in this perverse democracy, you think 65 outvotes 35, but 35% is a bigger market than what we need to actually make it work. I think you can build high density in, and like Rob said, it's not New York. It can be 4 to 6 stories, or it can be single stories.
Just a very quick one. Barcelona is one of the densest cities in the world, 200 people per hectare. Have all the teenagers that grew up in Barcelona been disadvantaged? I think not. They've got open space, they've got access to just about everything. I think we live with this myth that somehow density doesn't allow us to actually have the things we want to do at any age group.
I think they play better soccer than the people in Western Sydney as well. But I'm going to do something a little bit different in that, Paul, given the metric that you used, which was 3 to 13, and given that you appear to be somewhere between the ages of 25 and 35. Oh, there you go. Have you
not young.
Yeah,
right.
Not young.
Not young.
Would you just like to respond to your own question in a way? I mean, I don't know if you've bred yet, but if you have got young kids between the ages of 3 and 13, I'd be interested as to whether or not you, in a personal way, have confronted that question, and I'd like to sort of understand your response to the insight from the people on the panel.
Okay, so I've got 3 kids at 5, 7 and 10, and I know my kids are getting a different upbringing than everyone else. I live on one of the few Burley Griffin estates in Melbourne, so we've got a common out the back. Our kids are outside every day. It's the classic case of go outside and play, we'll find you when it's dinner. And I know that most kids, well, vast majority of kids don't get that experience. And so the concern is when you have higher density, yes, we set aside the space for children to go out and play, but coming with that is the assumption that the parent has to accompany that kid. Right. And I know my lifestyle, we don't have that, and it's how do we ensure that you get that you don't have the parent handcuffed to the child for the child's recreation.
Okay, thanks, Paul. That was really interesting. Thanks. Now, we've got a number of questions from the floor. We have a woman here. We have a former leader of the Liberal and National Coalition here. We have a gentleman with a blue shirt at the back. Can I take the gentleman with the blue shirt? And you have a question as well. You've already asked a question. Why don't we go question from you, response, Leader of the Opposition, and then woman. So can you start? Can I rephrase that? Woman and then former Leader of the Opposition.
You're a great moderator, Nick.
Yeah, we'll go with the gentleman with the blue shirt first, if you could say your name, and
It's
we'll
John
take both
Benson.
questions and then a response.
John Benson, Eco Innovation and Design. We've enjoyed, my wife and I have enjoyed all of the lectures, and this one is no different. It's lovely, and it's nice to hear your viewpoints. One of the aspects that I seem to have heard many times is this business of aggregation as opposed to sprawling. And I wonder whether they could comment perhaps on the possibility in the future of us undertaking some sort of disaster in the form, say, perhaps not of an earthquake, but of, say, the eastern grid falling down. And how, in a situation where you had all these buildings compact, these people would cope. Given that in places like Haiti and Chile, in 3 days we had people committing violent acts, breaking into stores and losing control. Whereas, if we're living out in the suburbs, at least in our third of an acre, given that Factor 4 says that on 600 square metres we could grow enough for a family of 4, we could actually, if we chose to, catch our own water, generate our own electricity, grow our own crops, and move towards a lifestyle that has some chance of passing on love and time to our own family.
John, that's a lovely question. Something not too dissimilar did happen in Manhattan at some point, and I'll leave it to David to respond in a moment. But before then, can we take the question from this fellow with the blue top?
Yes, hi, my name is Richard Dianieri. Thank you. Thank you for your generosity. We are very, very privileged to be here, educating ourselves. I'm interested in the role of imagination, education, and the will that follows as part of a community consciousness. We don't know where the answers can come from. I think we're a privileged elite to be talking about these things and considering at leisure these things. In addressing what you've said, Sue, 35 years talking to people that you've touched power, and I was left with this image of that politician gazing down to the street saying, I see nothing there. I'm concerned about how we can meet that gaze looking up and engage a population that is educated, not looking, for us, not looking in this space today, not looking so much at the solutions. Solutions, there are many, there are plenty. And imagination will bring up even more, as will technology. It's the will that I'm interested in, and how it is that we move people to be that mass that meets that gaze. I think it's a circle. How do we encourage that courage in politicians or those who can do something about it? How do we encourage ourselves? I think education is very important. So my question specifically to you and others, do you know of any efforts to educate us all, to know what it is here and in the gut, what the challenges are, so that moves us to some degree of community consciousness and action?
Thank you very much. David, I think Con Edison had a bit of a problem in relation to energy in New York City a few years ago, and we've got a scenario here where we've got a real problem in Melbourne. Would you like to comment on what you think might happen if an eastern grid goes down?
Yeah, the density makes disasters more efficient too. It's the biological warfare, the warfare of any kind. So there's a tremendous, the list of downsides to population density is huge. The question is what scales, and moving people closer together scales on a global basis, and moving people farther apart doesn't. Just imagine taking Hong Kong and spreading it out at the density, take all the residents of Hong Kong and spreading them out at the density that the lifestyle you describe implies. It can't be done. In fact, when I first started thinking about this, it was multiplying my lifestyle by 330 million and just wondering how that came out. Now, it's tremendously difficult. And as someone asked me, why is it that you have not moved back to New York? And my usual response to that question is to stammer for about 30 seconds and then quote someone that I interviewed recently in connection with an article who's very involved in these issues, who said, I don't know how to live the way I want other people to live. And I think that's kind of the heart of it.
Thank you, David. Do any other members of the panel want to quickly comment on that question before we move on? No? Question in relation to engagement, Sue, from our friend at the front.
Yeah, I do think it's about hearts and minds and how people feel in their guts, and I do feel that that we lack leadership in Australia at the moment, and the story I gave about how we give our politicians permission to lead about these important issues is really about how we as a community mobilise to tell them that that's where we want to go. At the moment, the way we do that is through the polls. I think probably the Prime Minister knows now that the community is not very happy that he gave up on the ETS. The polls have told him now, polling is one way, Twittering is another way. There are all sorts of multimedia ways that we can let our leaders know. I don't think we can do it without them. We live in a democracy. I think we need them, but we need them to know how we're feeling. And whether it's through the polls or whether it's through this sort of engagement idea that we're exploring at the moment, you know, a television multimedia reality show, however we do it, I think we have to try and make people feel as though actually living differently is okay. It's really, we can make it okay, and we can see a future where we can feel good about solving some of the global problems and also feel good about how we're living. And I don't think it has to be expensive. I just think it needs a complete reframing of how we engage with it. And it is about how we feel in our gut. I agree with you.
Thanks, Sue. Any other comments from the panel? No? Good. We've got, not good, there aren't any more comments. It's simply that there's time to think of, and it's, I fancy tea and cake at 4 o'clock, and it's 25 minutes past 3, and I'd like to take 2 more questions from the floor. I'm also glad that you mentioned Twitter, Sue. I don't really understand Twitter, but for those who do, continue being part of the conversation on #TheDeakins. There's no .com, I'm told, just #TheDeakins. And the questions that I've not managed to get to from the break will all be up there on the Wheeler Centre website, so do keep an eye open for that. We've got 2 questions, firstly from the woman in the red and then from Malcolm Turnbull, or Lucy Turnbull.
Oh, hi. My name's Catherine Devney. I've got 3 children, and they're about the same age as Paul's, 7, 8 and 12. And I want to address the idea of living in children and how we can start to morph their ideas of a place to live. Firstly, I think that we've got to deal with the hearts and minds thing and blow out the water of this 1950s utopia, which only ever existed in the imagination of John Howard's grandparents. It didn't exist, and you know, I grew up in the burbs, and if you talk to anybody who actually grew up in the burbs, there was a lot of lawn mowing and a lot of aprons and a lot of staring at fence palings, wishing that we were somewhere where there was other kids and there was art classes and horses and football games and libraries and ice creams and places to run and do what we wanted. I lived in Tokyo for a while, and I've spent some time in New York and also in London. I adore Melbourne, and if I hadn't been born here, I would have moved here. And I'm very excited about, you know, eventually being buried here about the same time as you, because we're about the same age. And I'm looking forward to a whole new city, which hopefully embraces the truth of the society and the culture that we're living in, and not the narrative of the obsession with the nuclear family. And Barry, I was particularly thrilled about your proof of what I'd felt all along. This obsession with the nuclear family, some kind of modern and psychological bedrock of our society, is a fallacy and changing dramatically with what you said is the...
Kath, have we got a question?
I do. And what I wanted to say, my point is that, like, a lot of people in the inner city are finding it hard to do things simply like getting schools open for kids to play in on the weekends and things like that. How do we address this kind of issue, blow these fallacies out of the water for our children so they can move on and be the next designers and architects and policymakers, and do things as simply as get the neighbourhood schools open so there's more places where people can meet, greet and play?
Thank you, Kath. Thank you. Thank you. Now, we've got immediate past presidents. We're also lucky enough to have a former Lord Mayor of Sydney. Lucy, did you have a question? Is that right?
About how you get to greater density and greater intensity of use of city centres. One of the big problems in New South Wales is that there is no way of recycling or folding in a large residential building site once it's outlived its utilities. In the 1960s and the 1950s, there were some really large strata developments in the early manifestations. There is no way of actually winding up one of those strata schemes and making something else happen which can be denser, better designed, more sustainable and better adapted to changing demography. And the other thing, which is I think somewhat related to it, is how do you capture the value uplift anywhere in Australia to pay for rezoning or greater density, to pay for things like public transport and affordable housing and more green space?
Thanks, Lucy. I'm going to start up one end of the panel and ask for responses from all of the panel on those two questions, and then I'm going to hand over to Tim, who's the curator, and then we can go and have our tea and cake if that's what we want. David, there's maybe slightly Melbourne come Australian-centric questions, but I wonder if you'd like to comment on anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's the crux of it. And if I understand the first part correctly, it's how do we lift these people up and sort of hold them over here while we tidy up where we've got them at the moment. And I don't know. And it's certainly true in the States, where we've done such a huge amount of bad development that it's very hard to know what to do about it. And also, I'm at the risk. I realize that I'm avoiding your question by answering a different one. I was in. It's interesting sometimes where the resistance to, even if you have a good idea, where the resistance comes from. It's often from surprising places. I was in Seattle recently, and there was an attempt there in downtown Seattle to build an apartment building in which the residents would be not tied to their automobiles. It would be to encourage the development of walking residents of downtown Seattle, to increase to loosen the dependence on automobiles. Much of the resistance to that building came from 60s era environmentalists who were their antennae went up at the thought of any development in a city, because the city is bad. And the tool that they used to fight it was the argument that the building did not provide enough parking spaces to the people who would be living in it, and their cars would therefore spill onto the street. So I think at every turn, especially in the United States, I think Australia is actually far ahead of the United States in terms of understanding these issues and planning for them. You never know where you're going to get tripped up. No one is worse at urban planning than New York City. Everything good that has happened there happened by accident.
Thanks, David. Bruce?
On the multi-use of public buildings, I think it does happen. It doesn't happen as much as it should. I'm sure that it happens here. Look, I grew up in the suburbs. I actually loved it. I live in a 55 square metre apartment now. I love it too. I think you can do both. I played in schools on weekends, broke windows, did the whole thing. It happens. On the strata title thing, Lucy, I think you can change the laws. I think when Sue was DG, that I think there was a review led by the property sector and maybe the Sprout report. There was a review that said you need to change the strata laws to open up that redevelopment potential. I live in an apartment. The owners' corporation is dysfunctional. You can't even organise to fix brickwork, let alone redevelop the site. But one thing on the strata laws that's worth saying, the strategy for Sydney to reduce emissions by 50–60% relies on embedded generation within the city. Change of fuel use, running gas-fired engines or fuel cells within the city. Strata title law is a big obstacle to that, because there's no developer worth their salt that will put money into infrastructure within a new development and then be forced through third-party enforcement rules of getting knocked off if someone doesn't want to use that infrastructure. So there's rules have to be changed, and they're just rules to me. I don't see the big leap. I think we'll end up with low-carbon precincts that are private infrastructure monopolies, where third-party enforcements don't apply.
Thanks, Bruce. Rob?
Just to the first question about public buildings and reusing them. An interesting example that occurred in the 80s was in Dublin, where Dublin recreated a whole area of the downtown called Temple Bar through cultural institutions. And one of those was a thing called the Ark, which was an institution for young primary school kids to meet with practicing artists and create whatever it was they created. I think there are models there that we need to have more of. If you walk 100 metres down here, you'll see a red brick building. It's called Art Play. If you go there this afternoon, you'll find young primary school kids with artists actually working. And if you walk 150 metres that way, you'll find another one called Signal. And it's adolescents who are creating videos, movies, music, and externalising it through that little building down there. They're only very small buildings, and I wouldn't argue that that's enough, but I think there's a start there of realizing and actually valuing creativity. We do not value creativity enough in our education. Kids like me at 13 were asked, are you going to do art or are you going to do biology? And our parents said, do biology, you'll get a better job. Wrong answer. You know, we should value the creative people and actually invest in that creativity. The strata title one, I think it's a small problem because I don't think there's much strata title. It's become a problem, and I agree with Bruce, we need to modify those laws. But there's still plenty of fabric that is not in strata title that can be converted. And we've started a 1,200 buildings program here where we're retrofitting 1,200 buildings in the CBD for greater efficiency. In 1992, when the residential population came back, most of those were retrofitted buildings. So I think strata title is a developing problem and we need to actually get to grips with it. But I don't think it's as big as stopping us from going forward.
Just before today, Tim Flannery said to me, Nick, you're slipping a bit. I used to be pretty despotic in terms of finishing these sessions absolutely on time, and I realise that we're over 5 minutes overtime, which I do think is a little disrespectful of people who might have other things they want to do. So I just asked the final comments from Sue and from Melinda to be sharp and clear in response to the questions from the floor.
Okay. Answer the question about from the lady in the red dress and multi-user buildings. I think that's a really good example where local communities need to mobilise to say, we want to use that building and what's standing in the way of us doing it. On the strata issue, I have to say I think it's a huge issue, and I think it's a huge issue that will block initiatives to become more climate friendly. I've been fighting for a year now to try and get solar hot water panels on my roof. It is exempt development from the local council, and the strata is not wanting to approve it because they're concerned about what it might look like. And I think, quite apart from the redevelopment challenges that Lucy has highlighted, it's a major, major issue, and I have been working to try and get the laws changed in New South Wales. I think we have to change the way in which those strata laws work, or all of our good hopes for more efficient buildings, climate-friendly buildings, will be killed dead.
Thank you, Sue. Melinda, some final comments in response to the questions.
Okay, well, to pick up on the panel's responses, I'd like to add that I don't particularly like the expression knock down, rebuild, which is a very popular catchphrase in Australia. And of the buildings that we occupy now, houses and other buildings, 50% of them will still exist in 2050, and we know there's a lot of embodied energy in those buildings and houses. So we really do need to look at our existing housing stock, our existing building stock, and its potential to solve some of these other issues that we're facing. And so thank you.
You know, our panellists have given us a really fascinating and illuminating overview of the problems we face in the built environment and some of the solutions. I hope they don't take it disrespectfully, though, that for me personally, I found some of the most interesting ideas to come into my mind through this session came through the questions. Leon raised a particularly interesting issue of ancient cities. What can we learn from ancient cities? John asked about disaster management. And I'd just like to share with you a little bit of information about ancient Rome, the most successful city arguably ever. It lasted for 800 years, population of 1.5 million at its height. Have a guess how many houses there were in ancient Rome? 2,000. Right? Almost all of the inhabitants lived in the 46,000 apartment buildings of the city. They were called insulae. They were legally up to 7 stories high, but many were much higher. There was one famous as the kind of the Empire State Building of its day. And of course, without electricity and without proper fireplaces and so forth, almost no one cooked at home. Ancient Rome was a fast food culture. Go to Pompeii, you'll see the little takeaway food stores on every corner. It was a place of immense multiculturalism. I would argue even more multicultural than a place like New York today. Between 60 and 80% of all the surnames in ancient Rome in the first century came from Greece, the Middle East or North Africa. There was almost no one from the Italian peninsula living in ancient Rome. It was a place of exceptional liberation for women. Women could divorce their husbands with alacrity, they could inherit property, they were in control of their lives, at least if they were women from the upper classes, and they were controlling their fertility. Family size was plummeting through the early part of the Common Era in ancient Rome. It's interesting, it even had its own version of Google Earth. It had a thing called the Forma Urbis, which was present in the Forum of Tiberius, a 1 to 240 scale map of the entire city. No one was allowed to approach it. There was people with very long pointers who could point to things in a legal dispute there. But whenever a road alignment occurred, or wherever someone got permission for a development that changed the city, someone would carve out a new marble piece of the Forma Urbis and replace it on the old one. An extraordinary city. In fact, a city so crowded that the Emperor Augustus had to ban all carriage transport, all vehicular transport between the hours of dawn and dusk, something perhaps our modern leaders could look at as a bit of a lead. And I would argue that that incredibly modern urban form is a result of that old Shakespeare phrase, sweet are the uses of adversity. That it was adversity that kept Rome so compact. In that sense, it doesn't give us a great guide for how we do things today, but it does tell us that the human template, the template for the urban form, is not necessarily as we have it now, that there have been very successful events in the past. In terms of disaster management, what killed ancient Rome? Really, really simple. Alaric, in 410 AD, simply seized the port of Ostia. That every 24 hours the great breath in and breath out of the city when food was brought in overnight and so forth simply ceased because the grain from North Africa could not be brought into the city. Subsequently, other barbarian invasions took an even easier route, just cut the aqueducts, and the city was deserted almost instantly. It's a great warning to us as we increase our urban density. Distributed forms of energy generation, urban farms, urban grown food are all essential in establishing the resilience of what we inevitably need as very densely populated cities. There's one other example I want to just talk about very briefly. The greatest cities on our planet arguably haven't been built by people at all, but by the termites that exist all over the earth. Cities of millions with air conditioning systems of such enormous, staggering complexity that they beggar belief. Skyscrapers, if we measure them as a percentage of the size of the individuals that inhabit them, many, many times greater than anything humanity has ever achieved. Gardens inside these great cities that feed the populace. Garbage disposal systems that never for a second fail. And wells, of course, water systems, everything else. How has all this been achieved? Very, very simple. The interests of the individual inhabitant of the city are totally confluent with those of the city itself, of the superorganism itself. And the one rule I think we need to apply to every decision we make at every turn is how we make the interests of the individual, whether they be a developer, an investor or a simple inhabitant, confluent with the interests of the city or civilization itself. Easy to say, very, very difficult to do, but we've heard much from these people about how that might be achieved. We need to take the big view, simply the confluence of interest of those two entities. Thank you very much for being here today.